God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up. You may be seated. Some years ago, when the United States Armed Forces were searching actively for Osama bin Laden, they decided to put out a $25 million bounty on his head. They thought that this huge sum of money would encourage Afghans to give them information that they would need. The problem is they overshot by a good bit, because the average Afghan had no conception of what $25 million was. And so some reporters in that area, they were asking some people what they thought about having that amount of money. And one person said, well, if I got that amount of money, I would buy a new horse cart. And another person said, if I got that amount of money, I would have enough food for the year. They had no idea how much they would have if they had all of that. Of course, we have probably a little better idea what $25 million would offer our lives. And so that's not really our problem, but can I suggest that what our problem might be is that we can have so very much and yet still have very little idea about all that we actually possess. Or more typically, perhaps, we can have so very much and yet somehow still be amazingly forgetful about all that we have been given. I mean, I know I can. This past week, I saw a commercial that some church did that kind of went viral, or at least viral in a priest world. And in this little video that they made, this man wakes up and he's totally wrapped in wrapping paper. You get the sense real fast, he's a gift. And he takes the wrapping paper off and he turns to his wife, who also is in wrapping paper. His wife is a gift. In come his children, wrapped in wrapping paper. His children are gifts, and everything in his house all of a sudden is a gift, and he's kind of seeing it for the first time with new eyes. And so he turns on the light switch, on and off, on and off, on and off. Oh my gosh, can you believe it? It comes on just by doing that. And he goes to the sink and he turns on the faucet. It's amazing that we have clean, fresh water just by turning a knob, and it'll heat up, and can even take a shower. And he goes down, and the food for his family is all wrapped up as presents. Even his car is. The point being obvious that if we look right, our lives are amazingly gifted. We have so many gifts, and yet it is so easy to forget all that we have. I know when I start to play kind of small ball with life, when the details that shouldn't matter overmatter, and I become forgetful of all the blessings of my life. On more than one occasion, Shelley has told me, it's time for you to go to Haiti again. Not to get rid of me. I never thought about it that way, actually. No, but because she knows the gift of perspective that offers. The gift of perspective of helping people in need, and the gift of perspective when you step out of our affluence and abundance and really are surrounded with deprivation and need. All of a sudden, your forgetfulness goes away. And what I want to suggest to you today is that a great amount of the Christian faith and practice is disciplines in paying attention. It's why the Bible so often says to keep watch. We heard it in Thessalonians if you were listening this morning. To take notice, to stay awake, or many times to simply remember. It's why we go about this practice of gathering together and wrapping our minds and our lives around these stories by presenting them to ourselves, by going through the act of confession and remembering what we do wrong and receiving the assurance of God's forgiveness. Because what we're doing is remembering, we're paying attention, we're staying awake, we're keeping watch. So much of our faith, in other words, is calling us to exercises in attentiveness in a world of forgetfulness, a world with amnesia, and our lives that can so easily be forgetful as well. This is why Jesus so oftentimes said, you have eyes, but you're not seeing, or that you have ears, but you're not hearing, because somehow, through the myopia of life, the rage of other voices, we're not actually seeing what we need to see and hearing what we need to hear. And a lot of that, I think, for us is born out of our sense of scarcity, even though we live in a world of abundance. But our sense of scarcity and how it causes us to fear losing what we have. How much has come our way by way of gift, and how much is required because of it, because, after all, to whom much is given, much is required. Which brings us to the parable of the talents. Now, the word talent did not, in Jesus' world, mean talent as we use that term today. This isn't, The Voice, Palestine edition or something, American Idol for the first century. That's not what you were just hearing about. It's not that sort of talent, even though it's oftentimes preached like that. A talent was simply a unit of measurement. It's the highest one that existed in that day. And the way it's used here by Jesus in this parable is to suggest an unthinkable high amount of money. It's rabbinic hyperbole. It's like, a camel through an eye of a needle. It's exaggerated beyond belief. Now, if you want to be exact, a talenton in the ancient world was the equivalent of 75 pounds of silver, or 6,000 denarii. And you probably don't know what a denarii is, but a denarius, one of them, is worth a day's wage. And so a talent is 6,000 days worth of wages. It's roughly 20 years worth of work. And so what Jesus is saying here is that this manager decides to give his slaves, by the way, let's not forget that, anywhere from 20 to 100 years worth of money. So this is an unbelievable amount of money, and it's an unbelievable amount of money to be given to slaves, and what you're supposed to see is this is some kind of master, and boy, this is some kind of slavery. And it's supposed to sound really over the top and kind of crazy that would ever happen. To get to how it would sound to his original, hear it like this: a billionaire was going on a trip around the world. And yet before he went, he gathered 3 people who did manual labor at one of his estates. And to one, he gave $5 billion. And to the second, he gave $2 billion. And to the third, he only gave $1 billion. Now, my question is, knowing all of that, does it change the way that you heard this story? Because now you're hearing it more as Jesus' original audience would have heard it. What I mean is, at first when you heard the story, you may have been alarmed with the 1 talent guy, that he only got 1 talent as opposed to 2 or 5 like the others. Why did he get so little? Wasn't a little, is the first thing. And moreover, you might have been alarmed by his fate. And Jesus saying, he's going to take, this 1 talent away and give it to the guy with 10. And yet I wonder, now that you hear the story with all of its full dimension, are you still only concentrating on the 1 talent guy and his fate? Are you kind of wondering a little bit about the sanity of this master? I mean, you may have heard this story and only noticed the judgment at the end. And yet, what I want to ask is if you can also, and even first and foremost, hear this as a story about grace. Because make no mistake, there is judgment here. And yet, as is always the case with God, way before there is any story ever to be told about any sort of judgment, there's always a story about grace when it comes to God. And in fact, what we know as the judgment of God almost always works like this: what are you doing with all that I've given you? So this isn't wrath and fury. There's no divine fist just waiting to punch. What we are presented with here is an astonishingly generous God, who in turn expects those of us who have been entrusted with so much to do something with it. The slave who buries the money and does nothing with it, all that he's been given, he describes a master, if you were listening, that does not actually exist. A master that only exists in his fears. He says, I know you were a harsh man, but I ask you, how many harsh men do you know who give away 100 years worth of money? He says the master gathers what's not rightfully his. He comes across as stingy, almost greedy. And yet this master that we meet in the story is one who bestows his riches upon his slaves. And then lets the other two keep it all at the end. And so it is this man, with his inaccurate judgment of the master, that gains the master's anger. And because he chooses not to appreciate the gift, but only, I guess, just looks at the world about him and can see nothing, as we so oftentimes do, except some zero-sum game, whereby if I give or I risk or I do something with all that I have, I risk losing what is mine. And so he buries the gift out of fear. And so much like us, he hoards and cowards and therefore loses. This story is happening in Matthew's gospel right toward the end, which means that Jesus, when he's telling this story, is on his way to die. He's on his way to die in a world about to squander away the greatest gift that has ever been given to us. And to them, Jesus is saying, why don't you see what you've been given? Do your eyes not behold this gift that's just been placed in your laps? Does your fear? Have you not taken advantage of this grace? So the story tells a hard truth, and it is a judgment of sorts. If you and I choose to do nothing with the much that we've been given, we will end up with nothing. For gifts that are buried in the ground out of fear of loss are gifts that are worth nothing. A gift not used is equal to no gift at all. And thus the gift giver will give away his gifts to those who will use them. One of the things that I am most proud about of St. John's, and there's many, but one of the most amazing things about this congregation is how we use our building. This is a fantastic space that we have been given. It's beautiful, it's large, it has so much capacity, and we could just use that for ourselves and hunker down in here and feel pretty good about ourselves, I guess. And yet that's not at all how we use this building. It's shocking. If you come around here any day of the week, there is stuff going on here all the time. And the vast majority of it is happening for people in need. And yes, I mean, you can, on rainy days, get a lot of, wear on the carpet and other sorts of things that happens. And it's always, there's challenges when you open up your doors like we do. And yet, it is right in the very DNA of this place. To the degree that maybe some of you have been around here so long don't even recognize how unusual this is. The first church I ever went to when I was in seminary and I'd become an Episcopalian was All Saints in Kansas City, Missouri. And I worked at that church while I was a seminarian, and All Saints had what they called the parlor. And the parlor at All Saints was like the formal living room in your grandmother's house. It's this room that's really pretty, but you only look at it and nobody ever goes in there, and so you don't know why it actually exists. And I, being on staff, was asked to do an event for newcomers, and so I decided we were going to put it in the nicest place that we have. We're going to put it in the parlor. Oh my gosh, you couldn't imagine the backlash. Eric's going in the parlor. He's going to have people in the parlor. They may spill wine in that parlor. We've got to protect the parlor. We did it in that parlor too, by the way. And it was great. 3 years ago, about the time I was coming here, I was really sad to learn that All Saints, unfortunately, had to shut down as a parish. And so now no one's using that parlor. Now, I don't want to suggest that because they were hoarding the parlor that that's why they shut down. It's not. But it does, because that was a generous place, and I definitely want that to be heard. But it does ring out to me that, the things that we've been given, the riches of our lives must be used. That's why they're here, or why even have them. And the things in my own family's life and the things in my own life are here to be used as a blessing for the world about me as well. In Thessalonians, Paul describes Jesus as a thief coming suddenly in the night, which is kind of a negative image, right, for Jesus? Jesus coming in as a thief and stealing things, which is what thieves do. And yet, some biblical commentators have noted that maybe Jesus is coming in as the good thief to rob out of our lives things that need to be gone. And so today, Jesus is the master who gives and the thief who steals. And what I ask him to rob me of, and I hope you as well, is our fear, our sense of scarcity, our forgetfulness of where the blessings of our life arise, which in turn leads to our tendency to not use what we've been given out of fear that we're somehow going to be less. I hope he steals all that. And along with it, the idea that God is some harsh judge just looking for an opportunity to pounce, as opposed to the truth that God has given us so much, and he just simply desires us to use all of the good that he's given us for the benefit of the love and life of the world. As I look out week to week at this congregation, I thank God for the unbelievable people that you are. As I consider our children and our youth and those who give so much of themselves to care for them, when I think on the legacy of those who have come before us and handed this place into our care, when I marvel at the wisdom of the older members of our church that are still with us, when I hear the beauty of the musical tradition of this place and behold the magnificence of this worship space and the church building around it, all I can say is, wow, God sure isn't stingy. And I also hear a call on my life, and yours as well. A call saying, what will you do with all that I have given you? Amen.